Welcome back. As we start into the second week of our time together looking at the polity and professional leadership ethics of the United Church of Canada, we turn now to the subject of the region. And you may recall that one of the reasons for the change of structure was the desire to reduce both the financial and human resources demands of the governance structure that existed before January 1st, 2019. Filling all the volunteer positions in presbytery, council, and general council structure was an immense strain on an increasingly small and aging volunteer pool. There was also significant sentiment that the different tasks assigned to the presbytery and to the conference were, in many instances, both repetitive and burdensome to the pastoral charges which those structures were ultimately meant to serve. On the other hand, the interlocking courts of the church did provide for a high degree of investment from all parties in the various aspects of the church's life. Now, when the original proposal to revamp the United Church's structure appeared, it was a two-court model. There was a national body and the community of faith, with nothing in between. As a result, it invested massively increased powers in the local governing body in virtually every area of church life. Standards and guidelines would be established by the General Council, and the congregations would be expected and trusted to follow them. The result would be an unreservedly congregationalist model of governance. The communities of faith would have largely unchecked latitude in employment and property and financial matters. This model, of course, pleased those who were convinced that the presbytery and conference were an unnecessary and an intrusive drag on congregational mission. It would allow communities of faith to be incredibly flexible and responsive to local needs. Well, the proposed two-court model was a tremendous shock to many. For instance, it would have shifted the membership of ministry personnel from presbytery to the congregation. It would have made the retaining and dismissing of clergy much more like employment practices in the business world. It raised some significant legal questions about property, which we touched on when we spoke about the community of faith. Did the proposal mean transferring ownership of property from the United Church of Canada to individual congregations? How could that even be done? It was a significant concern raised from the congregation. Many of the congregations, smaller in numbers and revenues, who depended upon and who valued the support and resourcing they received from other congregations and from other levels of church governance. And there was a real and very fundamental question. What was united about this model of the United Church? As I indicated, the result was a considerable degree of pushback from every corner and level of the United Church. What had been proposed was simply too different, and the different distance between the communities of faith and the national body was simply too large for a significant majority of people to imagine that it would work. So a subsequent model was presented which included the region. The task group presenting the model, however, declined to specify the size or number of regions, which led to a great deal of debate and revealed how little some United Church know about other parts of our very, very big country. I recall pointing out to astonished delegates at Maritime Conference how many times Nova Scotia would fit into Lake Superior with space left over. It's a big country, and there are chunks of it which, in terms of human population, are significantly empty. There are also parts of it which are very, very densely populated. For instance, where it is populated, Canada is much more densely populated per area than the United States. We are a much more urban nation in terms of where people live than our southern neighbors. Of course, in the United Church of Canada, we also deal with the reality that approximately 2/3 of our membership is urban, while 2/3 of our congregations are rural. So creating equitably sized regions is challenging. For example, in the Maritimes, to get a population the size of Metro Toronto, you'd probably need all 3 maritime provinces plus Newfoundland and Labrador. But if we were to employ purely geographical standards, we would end up with regions of unmanageable numbers of members. In the end, the rough breakdown of the size of the regions is based on roughly equivalent numbers of congregations. More challenging, perhaps, than the geography entailed in the region model was the lack of an obvious theological rationale, and indeed of a genuine purpose. The congregationalist-oriented theology of the two-council model was evident in the high degree of independence for communities of faith. The region was clearly an afterthought, included to respond to the concerns raised by the Church by the two-council model. But what was the purpose of this third council stuck in the middle? If you think back to our first session, you may recall my opinion that the founders of the United Church sought an answer for what is the Church for. The answer was, the Church is for mission. They created a structure which they believed responded to that imperative. But what is the Church? If you were to ask an Anglican or a Roman Catholic theologian that question, chances are the answer would have something to do with the people gathered with their bishop around the sacrament. And in the case of the Romans, ultimately with the Pope. If you were to speak to more theologically conservative parts of the Christian tradition, the answer would likely have something to do with believers gathered around God's Word, seeking to live a life of Christ-likeness, or something like that. With that core theological conviction, it is relatively straightforward, though not necessarily easy, to build a church structure that moves the purpose forward. However, in the second decade of the 21st century, it is by no means clear that the United Church shares a singular mission. Rather, we have a multitude of missions to which the Spirit calls us. Given that those missions, if the communities of faith are genuinely aware of them, vary from congregation to congregation, not to mention from region to region, how do we create a structure that serves those while maintaining values which are clearly important to who we conceive ourselves to be? Recall that the rationale for change included reducing the numbers of volunteers required and making the system more nimble and responsive. So simply combining the various responsibilities and functions of presbytery and conference wouldn't work. Same numbers of people. And there was a strong, though not always clearly articulated sense that the communities of faith are where the action is, and that the structure should support that commitment. But what does that look like? From the point of view of those of us who focus on polity, the result is challenging. The manual, section C, is long on duties and responsibilities, but short on structure. And the end result is that each region was left to develop its own ways of fulfilling those responsibilities, thus creating a patchwork of structures across the church in which corresponding bodies may not exist or else look very different from one region to the next. I find it interesting that the amount of money set for the administration of the regions was determined before the number of regions was established. So the amount of money for the administration was set before the number of regions was established. And what's the impact of that? Well, let's assume that there is $6 million to spread between the regions. If there are 10 regions, each has 600,000. But if there are 15 regions, then each has 400,000, which, anyway, to my mind, still sounds like a lot of money. But think about it further. Assume that a region determines that the activities being undertaken requires a paid staff position. Roughly speaking, it costs between $90,000 and $100,000 to establish and support a full-time position. In the two situations, with a $600,000 budget or a $400,000 budget, in the two different situations, each position requires a different proportion of the financial resources, but the responsibilities given to the region remain the same. And so the result is that if you find yourself in a region, or rather when you find yourself in a region, whether through SME or as a new ordinand, you have to discover the particular structure of that region so you know where to make appropriate contacts if you need information or you need to move something ahead. Here are some general principles and highlighting the differences with the previous four-court model. The membership of ministry personnel is at the region. Previously, it was at the presbytery. That means that all ministry personnel are members of the regional council. Now, it's very difficult to generalize on what that means about clergy isolation because in the past, presbyteries met at different intervals of time. In some presbyteries, particularly in the north and the west, they met only a couple of times a year over a lengthier period of time because for some folk it required a plane ride to get to the presbytery meeting. In other places, presbyteries were used to meeting monthly or every 2 months, and there was a sense of bonding and camaraderie and connection between clergy. One of the things that seems to be happening with the regional model is a growth in a sense of isolation amongst clergy. The lay members of the regional council are in a very interesting position. Previously, the lay members were presbyters. They attended regular presbytery meetings, and they were conference delegates attending the annual meeting of conference. And the expectation was also that they would be part of the local governing body. In the new structure, it's the same proportion of people elected. One representative for every 100 members in a congregation, and one for every congregation in a multi-point charge. But they do not meet regularly in presbytery, and there is no manual requirement for them to be on the local governing body. What is the impact of such a structural change? In the previous model, where presbyters were doing their job, the local governing body regularly encountered the work that was going on at the presbytery level. There was somebody there with a foot in both camps, maintaining the communication. And in many cases, those lay members of presbytery felt a very strong responsibility to also inform the congregation. Lay members of the regional council aren't necessarily meeting with anybody outside of their own congregation unless an extra bit of work is being done to draw them together. And they aren't necessarily on the local governing body of the community of faith. There's a connection issue there. The regional council maintains the role of the minister. The office of vocation informs the region of who should be on that list. Communities of faith are recognized as legitimate United Church of Canada communities through a covenant with the region, and we spoke about that when we talked about communities of faith. The content and shape of the covenant is somewhat vague, but it must include the governance requirements for the community of faith in the bylaws of the manual, any applicable policies set by the General Council, and any other terms that the community of faith and regional council may agree to include within the denominational policies. So you can see pretty clearly from Section C of the manual the sorts of things a region is expected to do. We can also see where it meshes with the community of faith roles around property, pastoral relations, and so on. What is different is that each regional council was assigned the task of creating its own governance structure, which means that Unlike in the previous model, for example, in the 2010 manual, we can send you to a section on the conference, and it lays out pretty clearly and pretty uniformly how conferences were supposed to work. Whether or not they actually did fill all the sections and tick off all the boxes is quite another matter. Here's a couple of notes we can make. The Regional Council Executive has all the power of the Regional Council. And that's different from presbytery or conference executives, which had many of the powers of the body, but could not do all of them. In the current structure, the Regional Council Executive can do everything that the Regional Council can do. The region can choose to do its work in any form it seems to suit, including commissions. That's an important distinction. A commission and a committee are different animals. In United Church speak, a commission is a group of people appointed to do a task, and they have all the powers of the body that appointed them. So usually what happens is a committee does its work and makes a recommendation to the body that appointed it. The appointing body then makes the decision. In a commission system, the commission makes the decision and implements it without having to report back. So for a region to be able to operate by virtue of commission means that it is possible for things to move very nimbly, but to be in the hands of a much smaller body of decision makers. The region must meet annually, but note that it can be the executive that meets, not the whole region. For this class, you were asked to find the governance manual, the policy document, however it's phrased, for your region. You want to be looking at things like property matters. What's the role of the region in property matters for the local community of faith? I suspect that most of the regions will have a note made about at what point a property matter needs to be referred to the region. Now that will obviously include things like sales and leases and mortgages and so on, but I'm also thinking about repairs. The region does not want to be troubled with every time you replace a toilet or do some light fixtures or something. But if you enter into a major structural change, particularly on the basis of cost, the region will want to know. So there'll be something in there somewhere about the point at which the congregation needs to contact the region. It usually has something to do with a percentage of the budget or some figure like that. What happens around licensing? For instance, how does one become a licensed lay worship leader in the region in which you are serving? How is oversight of congregations exercised? In the previous structure, the pattern was for triennial visits. Members of a committee of presbytery would visit each congregation on a 3-year cycle and check in about life and so on. They would also read the annual reports and so on. And they would also check the record books and make sure they were being kept appropriately. I'm not waving a flag for that model, but oversight of the health and well-being of congregations is an important part of the region's work. How's it being done in your region? And as you look over that governance document for your region, do you notice any unusual committees or groups, things that you just didn't expect to find there? So those are the things that are significant about the region as that middle council of the church. I invite you to take seriously that group because they do have significant powers and can be significant for both help and impact on the ministry of your local community of faith. So take the time to become familiar with that, to know who the people are, and to recognize that they may very well be searching for ways to be helpful to communities of faith like yours, because it hasn't been made clear to them exactly what they're supposed to do and why they're doing it. so you can be part of an evolving conversation on the new shape of the United Church. We'll see you in discussion shortly. God bless.